What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. You already know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated with everything that happens on this channel. Guys, you made it to another episode of your favorite show, Brownie Points. This is the show, and I get so used to saying this, but it's the show that showcases South Asian creative individuals who have taken atypical paths throughout their life. And guys, we have a treat for you today because I'm so excited to talk to you about this guest specifically. She is the Jane of all trades, specifically when it comes to performing arts, an environmental engineer turned tabla player turned artist manager, booking agent, music school administrator, producer, curator, and the list goes on. Guys, it's none other than Hina Patel. Yo, Hina, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, what a bio. This is crazy. Like, I feel like you've done everything on the creative path.
A little bit, but I think that that's what has made it fun, and that's what lets me create the magic that I get to do right now. So yeah, I learned something from all the roles, so I wouldn't change it.
That's great. Honestly, I'm super excited to like dive in, kind of dissect what you've done and share to the viewers, like, you know, what you've done. For those of you who don't know, I saw Hina speak during the South Asian Productions event, and I was like, when you were talking about your story and everything, I knew I had to have you on this podcast because this is perfect. We literally like showcase people like you. At least I try to. So I'm really, really excited to have you here, Hina. Thank you so much for making the time to do this. Like, when you were going through, I guess, like, what kind of made you get into the creative path? Were you always kind of like a creative kid, or like did it kind of just, you stumble upon it?
No, so I was dancing since I could walk. I grew up in Toronto in the late 80s, the 90s, right? And Toronto has a massive Indian population and even a really large Gujarati population. And so I grew up really doing what a lot of, I feel like, South Asian kids or Indian kids did is I was doing Bollywood dancing. Like, my cousin would teach me dances for like cultural programs and like private events, right? Like someone's birthday party or anniversary. But then also I was participating in something called FOGA, which was the Federation of Gujarati Associations. They did an annual massive folk dance competition. So my childhood was filled with Garba practice from like January to May, every weekend from like 9 to 1 o'clock, right? With like hundreds of other kids, right? So, yeah, so I've been doing Gujarati folk since I was a little girl, Bollywood casually since I was a little girl, dabbled slightly in Indian classical dance, like not much. I also lived with my grandmother, or my grandmother lived with us, and that played a huge role because I grew up hearing stories of Hindu gods and goddesses. And, you know, my grandmother was very religious, so it was about doing the puja every night and aarti and all of that stuff, right? So, and speaking Gujarati at home because she didn't speak English. So I grew up with a lot of Indian cultural influences in my life that really sort of informed my love of culture and heritage and understanding of that all.
Very cool, very cool. Like, it's kind of funny because on the contrary, I didn't have what you had. I actually grew up in Iowa, and it's like predominantly white. There's a lot of racism, especially during 9/11 time, that I've talked about earlier in earlier podcasts. But it's really nice to hear you talk about how you were like, you know, learning these like stories and, you know, alongside your grandmother and like having the Indian culture at a young age. I think that is so influential in anybody's life, especially people like us, to like maintain that connection.
Hugely. It's actually like, I'm really blessed in terms of where I grew up because Toronto's like the most multicultural city in the world. I literally felt like I had two lives. I had my weekday life, which was like school, and I went to school with a lot of brown kids, right? But then I had my weekend life, which was all Indian and really all Gujarati. So like it was like, you know, dinner parties at family friends' houses or someone's wedding. I mean, I went to so many weddings growing up. Just like the community was so large and my parents were so involved in the community. So I will say, like, one of my big influences in my life were my parents and my grandmother. So my grandmother, for example, started a satsang mandal in Toronto, right? Like for her religious sect. My parents were community organizers. They were the ones like they were involved in the Samaj or the culture, like the Gujarati cultural associations. They were involved in the temple. So we got involved. Like I was super involved as well. So, I mean, I remember one of the last Foga competitions was really a family affair. Like my parents were the ones who were like spearheading it. I was a choreographer. I was teaching, like I was, I think like 14, 15 at that time. And I was teaching the little bachas, like the minor group of like the 5-6-year-olds. I was choreographing them. So, you know, I grew up seeing my parents super involved in the cultural life of Gujaratis in Toronto. And because of that, I got super involved in the cultural life as well.
That's so interesting for me to hear that, because I'm like the complete opposite. Well, like for the beginning part of my life, because in Iowa, like yeah, while we did have an Indian community, it wasn't as like in depth and like as like structured as yours probably was. But then,
I mean, the Midwest. I wouldn't imagine that the Midwest in like the 90s or early 2000s was the same that as Toronto was. Like Toronto, I mean, we had we would do Garba at the Canadian National Exhibition Center, a place, and there was 10,000 people coming to Navratri Garba in the 90s, right? So that just gives you a sense of the scale, like the size of the Gujarati community in Toronto. And then the South Asian community was like even larger.
What? That blows my mind. That's crazy. I'm so jealous that you got to go to Garba. Like I've till this day, I've never been to Garba or like any like I've only been to 2 weddings.
Oh my God. Okay. So you are the reason why one of the experiences that I produce and curate is called Garba 360. And you are literally one of the people I've created it for, because Garba is obviously something that's just so close to my heart. Like I grew up doing it at like, you know, the high school gymnasium. Like we would have hundreds of people. Like my Samaj would have this massive one. And then all the other Samajas had their Garbas too. So Garba was like huge, right? But there's a arts experience called Garba 360 that I produce that's about taking Garba into new spaces and allowing more people to participate in it. Because if you're not Gujarati, or if you're not really good friends with a Gujarati, right, who's getting married and happens to do a Garba for their wedding, or if you didn't go to a university that had a huge South Asian population that decided to hold a Garba on campus, you probably didn't go to Garba. Like that's a reality, but Garba is like so fun.
True. Exactly. That's so cool. So I guess I kind of want to dissect what you just said there about like, you know, you creating this experience. Is this more so directed to like South Asian individuals who haven't experienced Garba, or just like anybody in the world who hasn't experienced Garba?
Anyone. So one of the hats that I wear is I'm a producer and a curator. So I'm a creator. So as a producer, you facilitate the creation of performing arts experiences. So that can be shows, etc. So Garba 360 is something that I am the creator and the producer and curator for. And Garba 360 was about taking this quintessential Gujarati folk experience and bringing it into new spaces and places. And it's really meant for everyone. So South Asians and non-South Asians. So our premiere season, we were doing Garba in the middle of downtown San Francisco. We were doing it at Lincoln Center, and we did it at Millennium Park in Chicago. So like massively public spaces with like hundreds of people, and you had South Asians or Indians showing up in Garba outfits because we would tell them wear chania chori if you want to. And then you'd have people in like jeans and t-shirts, and you had people of all ages and races and ethnicities doing Garba together, and it's like freaking beautiful.
That's so sweet. Oh my gosh, I want to come to one of those, honestly. That sounds so much fun. Oh my gosh. So do you explain like what Garba is during these events?
Yeah. So my work presently or pre-COVID, it sort of shifted with COVID, of course, because the performing arts sector has honestly been destroyed with COVID. What my work is about with Meg, I have a company called Mela Arts Connect, and what my company is about elevating South Asian performing arts and amplifying it, particularly in the mainstream performing arts spaces. But that's not just about, you know, bringing a South Asian artist to Iowa to perform for an audience that's like predominantly white, which we've done, right? But it's really about helping to build connections and facilitate cross-cultural exchange. So a lot of my work, particularly the work that I'm producing myself, is about thinking about the different audiences. So how would an Indian person or a South Asian person or someone who was like really familiar with the art form respond to a piece of work? And how would someone that has no understanding of what they're seeing respond? And it's always important for me to not just have something that's on stage that someone who's unfamiliar is saying, oh, that's cool, or that that was interesting, but go, that was cool and interesting, and I learned something. For me, context is so important. So yeah, at Garba 360, long-winded answer to your question, right? But at Garba 360, we explain what Garba is. We have dance instructors because I know that I've gone to Garba events and I see the people like hanging out in the corners going like, I want to do this, but I don't know how. I am legit the random stranger that will come up to you and go, you look like you want to learn. Do you want me to teach you so you can actually participate?
Wow. No, and I'm really glad that you said that, because I can't tell you how many times I've been to events like in my university that I don't have no idea what's going on because it's unexplained. And then like I remember, like, you know, we have a pretty big Indian I live in Michigan now, and I attended Michigan State University, and we have a pretty big Indian population there. But there's like, they throw events all the time, and I would bring like my non-Indian friends, and like nothing was explained, and sometimes I couldn't even explain what was going on because I'm like, I don't even know what this is. So I'm really glad that you really pushed that point of like explaining and having like, or gauging that question of like, you know, like what next. Like I'm glad that I learned, you know, like having that, you know, there, because I think that's super important in terms of spreading like South.
Context is important, right? I think there's a balance though, right? You've probably heard the term FUBU, right? For us, by us, that things don't need in the Black community, right? They're just like, we don't need to explain stuff. This is the stuff that we're doing for ourselves. I understand that. I respect that. And I think that there's absolutely spaces for that. I think it's really thinking about, for me, it's about what spaces am I putting work into and what is my purpose, right? And so when my purpose is to foster cross-cultural exchange and understanding, then I need to add the context piece, right? But there's also a really fine line of not over-explaining it and making every arts experience or performing arts show or like music or dance show into a workshop or a lecture, right? So how much is enough is also a constant question, and what needs to be done within the actual experience or the show itself, and what can be done before or after to facilitate that learning.
I understand. Yeah, that's very interesting. It kind of brings me like, it sort of raises a question for me, because so as I don't know if you know, but I make like TikTok videos on TikTok, and so a lot of it is directed towards the South Asian community. I really try to show like, you know, Indian culture in a comedic light, like really relatable content. But what I've noticed, and I kind of want to get your take on this, because you'll see non-Indian individuals, you know, talk about like Ganesha, or like talk about like anything related to like Hinduism specifically, and even doing some dances. But then I noticed in the comment section that like there's like a good mix of people that are like, well, one side is like, this person is like a colonizer stealing my culture, and then there's another side that's like, this person is just doing a dance, like what's the big deal? I kind of want to get your take on, you know, non-South Asian individuals kind of like, you know, doing things that are involved with South Asian culture. Like, do you personally get like offended by that, or like how do you, I know it's kind of like a loaded question, but
no, it's a great question. So I started my professional career in the performing arts because I was training to be a tabla player, and I had guru bhais and guru bens who were tabla players, right? And they were creating professional work, and I started working with them. Amongst my musical family and my guru bhais and guru bens is a woman who is South Korean, and she is a Kathak dancer and a tabla player. And she lived in India for 15 years, now teaches in the United States, and is a choreographer, right? Her name's Jin Wan. Another one of my guru bhais is a blue-eyed, sandy, brown, blonde-haired guy from New Jersey who is a tabla player. And those are both artists that I have, like, are part of my music family, but I've officially represented and got them shows and stuff like that. And it's a question that comes up when I'm in my work and working with presenters, right, and venues. And there's this question of what is authentic and what is okay and not okay. And again, it comes down to context, right? Jean Didi and Mike. I mean, Jean Didi lived in India, like moved to India, didn't speak a word of English, let alone any Indian language, right? Learned English in India, right? Now knows a little bit of Gujarati and Hindi, cooks phenomenal Gujarati food, like better Gujarati food than a lot of Indian people I know, right? Has studied Indian philosophy, has lived in the Guru Shishya Parampara, like working, like, practices 6 to 10 hours a day on her craft, right? Did that in India, does that now, right? She's someone who's fully immersed in the art form more so than so many South Asians I know, right? Like, and is way better and more well-versed than a lot of South Asians I know, right? Similar, like same thing with Mike. Like Mike literally lives in the same house as his guru, right? Like lives in the Guru Shishya Parampara, like lives in the same house as his guru. So art and culture is something that's not stagnant. Art and culture has always been influenced by different people. So, but you do need to be mindful, right? Like when you look at yoga, there's absolutely been a whitewashing and a colonization of it, right? Yeah. I get annoyed at even South Asian people who are like, oh, I've learned Kathak, and they don't even know how to like hold their arms, and like they've maybe taken a workshop. Yo, don't say you know Kathak, right? Like, I don't care if you're brown. I don't care if you're white. You don't know Kathak, right? So I think it's really intention. Mm-hmm. Learning, right? If you're learning it to just be cool, like I'm just going to learn movements, I think we need to learn history, right? And I will say that so many South Asian people I know who practice certain art forms don't make the time to learn history, right? So I would say they're just as bad as a white person or a non-Desi person trying to learn something and not taking time to learn the history, right? So for me, I different examples, right? But it's so much of it is about context and why. Like there's incredible scholars of Hinduism and Sanskrit that are not Indian and that have honestly devoted more of their lives and have way better understanding than the average South Asian person has, right? So you need, I think for the person who's non-South Asian, when they approach it, they need to be very mindful of their mindset and what they're doing and the influences they're bringing, right? And their perspectives. And I think that the problem happens when someone comes in with like, I'm going to learn this and it's going to be cool, right? Like, our turmeric lattes and stuff like that. Like there's absolutely a history of that and you got to be mindful of it, right? But can you say it's flat out bad? Hell no, man. Like, and that's the thing, that we don't go into nuance, and it's so important to understand nuance and context. Like intention is important. And it's not just about intention, because you can have great intentions and do something terribly, but it's intention and then follow through. So you really need to look at the whole picture as you look at it.
I like that answer. I really do. And I think that you and I sort of see eye to eye on that subject, because I like you, like I think it's important to, like, instead of just like deeming something immediately as like, oh, that's bad or wrongful, I think it's really important to look at that whole picture and really understand like step by steps of like what you're like a turmeric latte, like where that came from, and really understand like what that is really truly. And I think that gives respect to the culture. And I like what you said also about like how art is kind of like a mixing pot of different cultures, and I think that's so important and so often forgot about, honestly, like in certain scenarios. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up, and I think that's super important.
The thing is, if we weren't like it would be hypocrisy then, right? Like the fact that we see people doing like jazz with Indian classical, right? Or someone doing like hip hop with Bollywood or whatnot, right? Like then that stuff is not okay either.
That's, yeah, exactly.
Right. And there's times when that is okay and there's times when it's not okay. Like, you know, I see so much in like the dance space, right? Of people going, I do hip hop or I do this, right? And their exposure to hip hop is going to a hip hop or fusion class with another South Asian and not like going to learn from people who actually have learned like really spent time in it. Go to the workshop. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm really not saying there's anything wrong with it, right? But if you're gonna call yourself a hip hop dancer, right? Learn the history, right? Because there's a lot of oppression in there. There's a lot of like, and that's the thing that's also so important to be mindful of when you are not of that culture, or even if you're from the culture, right? Is that are you perpetuating oppression, right? Or are you taking advantage? Like there's people, you know, that were people who were practicing this vilified, right? Or targeted because they were doing it. And then you as a white person coming in can do it and it's cool, right? That's a history that you got to be very mindful of. Right. And I think even as South Asians or as Indians, right, and particularly like we need to be aware of caste as well, right? That comes into a lot of art, right? In a lot of different ways that if you look in, especially, I know a lot more about the classical traditions, right? But if you look at the classical traditions, there's so much caste hierarchy, right? That it was something that when the upper caste people did, it was okay, right? But then when the Tawaiffs were doing it, right? Like coming back to Kathak for a second, right? When the Nachahalis were doing it, they were lower caste and it was not acceptable, right? So, and then there's layers of like the British rule coming in and the anti-Nach movement and all of that. But do you get what I mean? Like there's so much layered history that you need to be aware of. And I'm not saying that you got to go get your PhD in it, right? But you got to learn it. You have to you have to learn about it. You can't just go, oh, I grew up here, so I get to just do this, right? Like no, like no, it's just not. You can't.
No, and that totally makes sense. And I think you're right. If you want to, you know, mark yourself as like a hip hop dancer or like you know, another like Bhangra dancer, like it's important to understand the history behind what you're doing. And I think that's like the only real way you can truly call yourself that you know, that this dancer or this whatever. That's very interesting. I've never, you know, you're actually one of the first people that I've talked to who's like given me that outlook and like who thinks of it like that. And like, you know, there's so many people that I've talked to about this this similar thing, you know, as creative individuals, we always talk to people and like everyone has their different interpretations on different things. But I think you're the only person that's like really brought up the importance of understanding the history of why you do what you do, and how that itself is determinant, like whether or not you can actually call yourself this thing or this thing, you know. And so like I think that's so important. I'm really glad that you touched on that, because that for me is like, you know, I'm a kid just like trying to learn this. I think it's important for me in my upbringing to learn my culture and to really be appreciative of you know, what I'm doing and where it comes from.
I think so often, and I was like this too when I was in my 20s, right? That you have this energy that anything I do is new, right? And I'm going to change things, right? And like whatever happened in the past is like, people don't know what they're doing. Like there's definitely a sense of entitlement and an ego, right? Because you see the things that are not working first and you want to change it, or like no one's doing this and no one's doing that, so I'm going to do this, right? And I mean, okay, tangent for a second. So many times an artist comes, like there's many times when an artist will come to me and I'm like, I'm the first, or I'm one of the only, and I'm like, really? You don't need, like we've associated this like thing of it's only cool if you're the only person doing it, right? If you created it, like, but there's also, as a creator, you're birthing something new and you want it to be original, right? But it is so important to remember those who came before us that allow us to do what we do today, right? Like that. So it's you can only have the ability to be a creator today because someone else did work that allowed you to do that. Right. So if we don't sit and acknowledge that, right, and they might have done stuff in ways that you would change, and that's okay, right? They did it with their context. And so it took some learning, even for me, right? That I wasn't, I I learned about history in terms of like mythology and older stuff, right? But recent history wasn't something I spent a lot of time around until I got a little bit older. And I realized you need to learn your history. You need to know, like, you need to acknowledge the people. Like, you need to not just acknowledge, but you need to understand the work of the people on whose shoulders you can now stand,
I love that. I really do.
right? And I think those who come maybe from a classical tradition, because maybe part of this comes from the fact that I studied Hindustani music and I learned in the Guru Shishya Parampara, right? That you need to know your guru and you need to know your Dada Guru, right? Like, you need to know the tradition. So you have to be familiar with the work. So that, that's where it sort of started coming into my training. But yeah, you need to know who came before you, whether you're working in contemporary, like whether you're a producer or a DJ, right? Like, if you're a DJ, there are people who changed the paradigm when it came to being a DJ within the South Asian context, right? Like, the stages that we have right now, right? The opportunities that we have, we owe to people who are doing this work before you and I were here.
That's very true. Yeah.
Right. So you need to understand that. And then you're like, I'm going to build on that. Fantastic. Right. But know this lineage, because you're sitting there trying to go, I'm going to change things. Right. People want to be artists to change people, like to change the paradigm, to like influence lives. Right. Like that, like those are some of the reasons you create. Right. You're hoping that you're going to inspire someone. Right. So you're part of this chain, but the chain didn't start with you.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. No, and I agree with you. I definitely think it's important to really understand the people that have done it, who have like suffered and like haven't been given the privilege that we've been given as millennials. Growing up here in the United States or like Canada, for example. We oftentimes forget that we're so privileged compared to like the people before us. And I really do think you're right, and I think it's important to give thought to those people.
And when before us means even 10 years before us, right? Because our community has like grown and shifted so rapidly, right? So even the context within someone who's 10 years older than you, and the context in which they operated is going to be vastly different.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Hina, you seem so like knowledgeable and woke about like, understanding the history and, really giving importance like towards the history and understanding, what you're doing and where it came from and really giving, like really, really placing emphasis on that. And I want to kind of dive into where that started from you. I know you kind of brought it up with like your dance, but like what really became that driver and that motivation for you to spread South Asian culture in the way that you do through like your multiple different like facets?
So I'll say this, I'm not so woke, right? I mean, I have issues with the word woke because there's a woke police and there's a whole thing around like who's woke enough. I'll say that the work that I do in learning history, I'm absolutely on my own journey. It's really new, for example, for me to understand caste privilege, right? That's a really new journey that I'm on. But as I learn, I try to integrate into what I do, right? So I'll say that I'm on a journey myself, right? Where it started, honestly, I feel so. I have always been about education and like sharing culture. So growing up, I told you that I was choreographing and teaching from a pretty young age, right? I, started our temple youth camp because I wanted to have kids have an ability like to understand Hinduism and heritage more. stories were always part of my life and culture was always part of my life, right? Like when I got to college, I started a dance company, but it was an education-based dance company. So we were all about sharing about these different dance styles. And then we would go into schools and hospitals and be doing South Asian dances, right? It wasn't just, hey, we're going to learn this routine and just go perform it. We're like, no, okay, this is Rajasthani folk or this type of folk or whatnot. And so sharing in context, like I keep saying that, I think I sound like a broken record right now of talking about context, but the why has just always been important to me. Because, for example, when I graduated from college and moved to India, it was this really interesting journey of like living there for 15 years and talking to people and learning more about why they do things, right? So I just had these questions about why. Like I distinctly remember, I think a lot of South Asian women or Indian Hindu women go through this question of like, why can't we go to the temple or do puja when we're on our period, right? And or like I don't want, like this is oppressive, and I wanted to understand, well, why? Where did this come from? Right. So there's just that inquiry and me learning, then wanting to share that. Because again, I feel that when you share context, you build understanding. And for me, it was always about building understanding. Like, how do we help each other learn more about each other?
Yeah, yeah. Very cool. That's so interesting. Yeah, no. I like that. I like that answer a lot. Yeah, honestly, like I like all your answers that you give me because they're so like impactful, and like they hit me personally just because like, I'm a South Asian individual. I'm trying to do creative stuff, and everything you hit, like you're saying, it really I feel very connected with you on that sense. So it's really cool. I kind of want to dive into honestly like how you became like who you are, like taking all these creative routes, like you're a tabla player, like you were an environmental engineer. Like how did you start finding out that you wanted to end up in the creative space? And did you ever receive any backlash from like your parents, like the community and things like that?
So like I said, I was dancing since I was a little girl, right? And I continued doing that through college, became a civil and environmental engineer, moved to India because I wanted to get field experience in water and sanitation work in the global south, because that's what I wanted to focus on professionally. While I was there, I was going to be in India for 2 years at least, and I wanted to spend time learning a classical art form because I felt that was missing in my dance training. Like, well, I had Garba training, but that was about it, right? And I felt like I wanted to do a classical form. I started taking tabla classes instead of taking dance, because a friend was going, and I was like, cool, I'll go with you. And I just enjoyed it so much. Honestly, it was just this beautiful blend of art. There's also science. Like my guru, Pandit Divyang Vakil, he, would often speak about the science around it, like vibration theories and stuff. And it was also something that was spiritual. And because my guru is really well versed in philosophy and spirituality as well. So it seemed like here was this one thing in which I could get all of this, like artistic, scientific, like there's like a sciences element to it and then a spiritual element to it. My Guru Bhais and Guru Bens, soon after I started, Guruji gave permission to a new batch of students to start performing professionally. I mean, they were already they were really talented and really highly trained, but they were allowed to do more professional shows, right? And they were amazing. And my guru had created a more contemporary way of presenting classical tabla in a way that was more accessible, and they were freaking awesome. Right. And I was like, people need to hear this. I was still doing water and sanitation work on the side. But I think at some point along the way, I happened to also be good. And I was progressing pretty quickly with my tabla playing. And Guruji had said to me, like, he had actually had a lot of people from outside of India start learning tabla at an older age, right? Because I was in my 20s. And and starting to do it, being able to like pursue it professionally. So he's like, if you want to do it, there's options, right? And I was like, what do I have to lose? I could always go back to my engineering degree, right? Let me just give it a shot for like a year or two. So Guruji said that, you try it for a year. I'll see if I want to actually have you as my student, like if you're worthy to be my student, and you see if you want to do this. So I was like, sure. Like, what do I have to lose? And so that's what I started doing. But I come from my parents are like great, but my parents also didn't know anything about classical music. So they're like, our girl went to India, was doing like social service and helping people get access to clean water and toilets. And now she's becoming a tablachi. Right? They're just like, what? What is going on? And I think that they definitely thought that it was like a phase. Mm-hmm. Like, sure, like, Carvado, it's a phase, right? But I legit made a business plan for my father, who's a business owner and an entrepreneur. And I like made a business plan that showed him my earning potential as a tabla player.
That's funny.
Like to go like, things will be okay. And I started organizing. So the tabla ensemble was phenomenal. And like Jean Didi was great. So I just started trying to figure out, like, people need to see them. So let me figure out how. And growing up in Toronto, I saw a lot of like how shows are done, right? Like who puts on the shows. So I'm like, there has to be a method to this madness. Let me figure it out. So that's what I would do. So that's what I started doing. I was like, how do you do shows? But we were really clear when we started, because Guruji had created a form of presentation that was really accessible, right? And it was really meant for the masses and the connoisseurs of tabla. I was very like, I was really clear, and so were they, that we didn't want this to just be, you go to North America, you like go to you perform for Indian classical music societies and come back, right? That this was meant to, we're trying to take tabla, break it out of just like these small circles of classical music lovers. So it was about, how do I get them to the mainstream, right? Not like outside of the diaspora sector. And so that's what I started doing. It was a lot of Googling. Google is like my best friend. Yeah. And this was a time where like international calling was not cheap on your phone. So I would like research during the day, and internet speeds weren't very high, like very fast. So I'd research during the day, and then I'd go to the internet cafe at night and call and hope that people picked up. Wow. And so that's how I started booking tours and becoming a booking agent. Didn't really know what it meant to be a booking agent, but that's what I started doing. Put together tours for the tabla ensemble Talavia and Jean Didi, and started coming to conferences here in the United States, because Guruji also had a tabla school in New Jersey. So yeah, the Talim school existed here. So we sort of had a base here in the United States. And started coming to conferences and meeting people, found my first mentor, who then we started working together. So she heard Talavia, like we were going to Atlantic, Canada, of all places. Like I had gotten some shows there, and she happened to live there, and she got some extra shows there for us. So she saw them, she fell in love with them. So then we both started working together to book them across North America. And it was pretty dope. Right? Like we were, some of these festivals we were at, we were like the only South Asians there. But it was super cool. So because of that, I learned how to be a booking agent. I had to do marketing. I was their photographer. I was their MC. I was their tour manager. Like I would be driving them around in like a 15-passenger van, and like we're driving all over like Canada and the United States. Yeah. Ultimately, I learned how to play the harmonium, so we would carry one less person on the road to save costs. So I learned a lot of things with them, and in the meantime learned the ropes of the performing arts industry, right? Like this larger performing arts industry that I was going to these conferences and stuff like that. Yeah. And I was like one of the only South Asian people there, like literally. And I remember my first conference, I walked around, and we have these trade floors or expo halls where like all these agents have these artists, right? And each agency might be representing 5 to like 25, 30 artists, right? And I'm walking around and I'm trying to find all the like Indian and South Asian artists, and I couldn't even count like 10.
Really? Wow.
Right. And I was like, whoa, yeah. And I remember like being so mindful of that. And so fast forward like 5-6 years, I'm learning the ropes, and like I've learned the ropes, like I'm building community, and other artists are starting to notice what we're doing, or like what what's happening with my guys, right? And or like, will you represent us? Will you work with us? Because I've building these networks. So I started working with some artists that were outside of my musical family and did that for a little bit of time. But then I got to a point where I could continue on that path of being an agent manager where I could make high impact on a small number of artists, right? But I kept thinking back to what I'd noticed when I'd started, right? That there's so few South Asian artists. And in having conversations with predominantly white decision makers, right, who are deciding what shows and what artists to bring to festivals and on their stages, I was also learning about the hurdles of why they weren't presenting more culturally specific work, not just South Asian, but in general. What was the hurdle in them presenting world, the term that's very complicated, but world arts, right? And I realized that, and I was learning more about South Asian artists. I was keeping tabs on who's around and people were reaching out to me and seeing the gap even in terms of the artist's understanding of what they need to do, right? And thought that working with a few artists wasn't going to be enough, right? It wasn't going to change the paradigm. So then I shifted gears from being a traditional agent manager with a small roster to go, how do I just like increase lift up the baseline by 5%, right? Like how do I just change how do I change how do I create more access? How do I create, like if there's 50 presentations of South Asian artists today, how do I make that 500, right? And I wasn't going to be able to make that 500 necessarily by working with 10 artists, right? Because I'm trying to fit square artists into a square peg artists into a circle hole, for example, right? Because it's not necessarily the right fit, right? So then I shifted gears to go, I'm going to be the person that fills in the gaps, right? So it was saying, hey, if you have any question around like South Asian arts or community or culture or whatnot, come talk to me. Let me answer your questions, right? Because I was also noticing that people were just making decisions. Maybe I'm projecting, but I felt like people were making decisions without understanding. And as you know, I'm all about context, right? And I would literally see people like walk by me and look at like my artists, right? And make decisions of how this is not going to work in their venue. And it's like, come talk to me and maybe we can actually talk about how it can work, because I'm all about access, right? And creating touch points. So that's how I started shifting into being this cultural connector. And in this role as a cultural connector, I was part manager, agent, part curator, part helping them with like audience development and marketing. And we built out this like huge database of South Asian artists from across North America. And we're also working with some artists coming in from basically India, not really anywhere else. There's maybe a couple of Pakistani artists that I did some bookings for. And it was just doing whatever was needed, right? Creating this hybrid. And in that process, I was seeing more of the gaps, right? Because now, before, very few people wanted to talk to me because only the people that were doing world or could see a fit were talking to me. Now I'm just here, like, I'm here to help you figure this out. And I will also say that, when we talk about history, I was working at a time where so many Black and brown people in particular, and white people, had been doing the work to advance world arts, right? So I was coming in at a time when it wasn't so foreign, right? Or I was part of the tide of like, it was like the small community when I started, but now more people were starting to do it, right? And pushing for, we need to do global arts. There was a reckoning, there was starting to be a greater conversation around diversity in the country, right? And in our sector, there's also a recognition that traditional audiences, which are old and white, right, were going to be dying off, right? And so people needed to start thinking about audience development in different ways and who are they serving. So in that sense, there was a lot of circumstances were coming together to allow me to do what I was going to do. Right? 10 years earlier, if I tried to do that, it would be much harder. There's people who have done it, right? There's an amazing woman who's been advancing Mexican arts for years, who's much older than me and has been doing for a long time, and other folks as well, right? But for me, it was really the perfect storm, right? That other people had done the work and I could really just come in this moment, right? Where there was like all these, and I'd had the experience, knew how to walk the talk, right? I knew the language, I knew the lingo, all of that stuff, super important, like those skills that I had been accumulating over the 5-6 years prior, to become this cultural connector, which a lot of people didn't understand in my sector. They're just like, what are you? Like people would tell me, they're like, can you send me your roster? I'm like, you want me to send you a couple hundred artists? Yeah. Right. This is not, so I was trying to change the paradigm of how we work in the field as well, right? Yeah. Or how you approach cultural work. But I was having these like, I could now have conversations with many more people, right? Because how the relationship of me to them, I was no longer a seller of selling something like these 5 things, right? But I was like a supporter and a resource. And I started noticing more of the gaps in the market, right? Of like, where are there spaces? What are people interested in? And in that process, started stepping into becoming a producer and creator, because I was like, oh, something like this would do really well and is really needed. And here's some artists who could do it, and started like connecting the dots there. So that's how I stepped into becoming a producer and also a curator, because I was a pseudo curator. I was curating for different people's needs, right? Artists for their needs. And so I started producing work of other artists and then my own. And so there's a bunch of different projects. Like the biggest probably is, one of the biggest is a show called Bollywood Boulevard, which was commissioned by Lincoln Center, premiered at Lincoln Center to over 4,000 people. When we did it, it was everyone on my team, the entire creative team, all of my performers, everyone was under the age of 35. No one had done anything that large in their life in terms of a show. So that was pretty freaking cool to like just be the conduit for that kind of learning for a lot of people. And, so that's what Mela started with the goal of amplifying South Asian, the mission of Mela was to nurture the ecosystem around South Asian arts and artists. Right? So it's about the ecosystem, thinking about all the different species. So when I booked an artist, I was working with them on their tech writers and talking to them about professionalism, or what does that mean, and how do you engage with presenters, right? So there's learning happening on all sides, right? And so we were about getting more artists onto stages and into the community, increasing the number of South Asians that were entering the arts sector as arts professionals, not as the creators, right? Not as the performers, but as arts professionals, right? And expanding the relationships and like the audio between venues and communities, right? And like supporting the communities. So I've produced a bunch of things, worked with South Asian organizations and Indian organizations as well, not just mainstream organizations, but essentially it's been doing a little bit of everything to advance South Asian arts.
I love that. It sounds like you had quite the journey too. Like it seems like just, the right place, the right time, with your interests combined with all these different things just led you to be the person you are today.
Well, and I will say this, it's also about not just being at the right place, but being prepared in that moment. Like I remember when I was creating Bollywood Boulevard, there's a moment where I was like, oh damn, I have been preparing for this moment for my entire life. That me with Bollywood Boulevard, my experience as a manager, my experience as an agent, my experience as a choreographer, right? My experience, like me doing marketing and understanding and working on community outreach and engagement, all of these pieces, the context work, all of like my musical work, all of that was coming together for me to be able to create Bollywood Boulevard, right? Like it was just, so I was ready as well. Like it was over the years, I had been expanding my toolkit. And to be honest, did I imagine I was going to be a producer? No, well, not at all. Right. But it was that moment of, hey, like we could do this, and me talking to the right people and just going, this is how, right? Learning to speak the language, a lot of code switching, like, because there's a lot of code switching in what I have to do in terms of like, how do I talk about South Asian arts or community or an artist to someone who doesn't understand it? It just came together so beautifully. And I just share that because oftentimes we think about, oh, I need to do like, how is this going to advance me, or how, like, where is this leading to? a lot of times I didn't know what the heck things were relating to. I was just doing it, right? And then there was these moments of like the pieces just falling into place. I was like, oh, I get it. So yeah.
No, absolutely. I think that's something that I need to know myself. You know, I'm glad they explained that because, you know, as someone who's just right out of college, just ready to go, I'm sure you were the same way, just like hungry to like, you know, do what you need to do. Oftentimes I get ahead of myself thinking like, oh, like, you know, what do I do? Like I just get all like scrambled because I want to have everything pieced out. But in the end of the day, you know, my life could change in any, like tomorrow, you know, I never know. I don't know what the end result will be. So I think it's super important to really think about like, you know, advancing your craft and taking the steps to be prepared. So when the opportunity does happen, like you're prepared for it. That's so, yeah, wow. I was gonna say, like, it's so funny you mentioned the fact that you were like you know, like the producer, manager, and all these. I actually got into like concert promotion in college, and I had no idea what I was doing at all, like not even the slightest clue. So I literally negotiated with these artists and like these like two DJs who I knew about. I DJ like throughout college, so I knew about these artists, and they were like they were like not headlining, but they were like in Lollapalooza, like all these music festivals, and I'm like, I gotta get them. And so I booked them and I booked a venue, and I was just me. I funded it myself, and I was stressed beyond belief. And it was funny enough, like the artists actually after that concert split up. They had like a fight after the concert and they broke up. So my first concert, I broke up two artists, which is never fun. Yeah, it was pretty scarring, but it is what it is. But I think you're right though, in a sense that it's really important to learn the craft and understand what you're getting yourself into and being prepared for it, like, you know, what you're going to do. Because, you know, for what I did, I could have been bankrupt in 2 seconds if I didn't plan, like if I didn't like really try and like advertise, market these tickets and things. I really poured everything into it. So that's super important that you brought that up.
There's so many things you can only learn by doing. Like you can learn them hypothetically, you can read about them, but it's only when you do them, right? There's like, I spend so much of my time talking to artists about the story, or like people who want to go into the arts about the stories of other artists and their backstory, because publicly you see them when they're in their moment of fame, right? You don't see the 10 years behind it, right? And just because of the space that I'm in, I get to know that, right? I hear these stories, like hear them from the other managers or artists themselves, right? I know what happened, like, oh, but this person 5 years ago, this is what they were doing, right? And it's actually really cool because I have to be really careful when I meet some artists or talk to some South Asian artists, because they've never heard about me, but it's my job to know what's going on in the sector, right? And who's doing what. So I will follow people for years, right? And I just keep they'll just be on my radar. I'm like, cool. Like, and because I know I work behind the scenes, right? I can sort of infer certain things that are happening and stuff like that, right? So it's just fascinating because I come to someone like, oh, I want to be this person. And I'm like, well, did you know this person did this and this? And then they're like, oh, no, I didn't. And I'm like, yeah, like it's not overnight. It's this accumulation of skills and experiences that ultimately supports someone in finding success. There's no freaking thing as an overnight success.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a certain like beauty to having like skin in the game. Like, you know, really, like for me, it was like monetary. Like I could have lost everything. So that's like, I think that definitely helped excel my learning. I know Kevin Hart, he has this quote that he says like, everyone wants to be famous, but no one wants to put in the work. And I think that's like his bio, and he always like lives by that. But it's true. Like, I mean, based off of what you're saying too, it's like you have to like understand the craft, you have to learn the skills, and you have to keep accumulating them. And I think you're right. I think that's very true.
You got to put in the work.
Yeah, no, exactly. It is what it is.
And you got to put in the work on all different aspects. It's not just your craft. Like that's the other thing. It's not just your craft, like your particular art form. There's a lot of other skills you need to learn about. Marketing, how to talk to people, like basics of professionalism, like a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think they all go like are in like a symbiotic relationship for sure. Well, Hina, I think that I want to end it here by asking you one final question. I think like what you just said kind of like segues into it. If you have any advice to give to like, you know, younger South Asian individuals kind of like ready to dive into this creative path, or who are like conflicted of whether or not they should do this or not, what advice would you give them?
A couple of things. One would be work on your craft. Work on your craft like every day, consistently. Like you gotta work on your craft. Two, ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. Like be hungry to learn. Like consume stuff about people's stories, talk to people in the field, like just learn, and be a sponge. You don't need to do all of it, right? But you should learn about it. You should learn how people have done it. You are probably not doing something new, right? Like, so it's important to also just burst that bubble of entitlement. I'm sorry to say, right? No one owes you anything. Mm-hmm. Honestly, no one owes you anything. So work on your craft. Be nice. Like, don't be an ass. Like, don't be an ass. Like, be nice. Be respectful. Like, so because when I'm talking about asking questions and talk to people, right? Be nice and be respectful comes into that. No one owes you anything in terms of even telling you what they've done, mm-hmm. or like spending or giving you half an hour of your time. No one owes you that. Like, you can ask politely, right? But no one owes you that. But so you got to keep showing up. Invest in yourself, right? Invest in yourself. That might be teachers for your craft, learning about these other skills, right? You got to make an investment in yourself. If you can't afford to make a financial investment, understand there's a lot of other places and ways you can learn online and for free and stuff like that, but make the investment. The more you can learn, and patience, things don't happen overnight. Seriously, things will take its time, and they will, it might sound like, oh, like everyone just says that, but they will happen when they need to happen. You need to be ready for that moment, right? You are not, and people said this to me, you're not the first one, you're not going to be the last one, right? But it's important to have that fire, right? There's many times where I try to go back to that fire that I had maybe as a 20-year-old that wasn't so jaded, right? Or it's not so like, oh, this is how it's done, right? But that's important, but it's also important, again, to remember who's come before you, to be respectful of other people and their own journeys and what has led them to do what they do. And keep at it. Don't lose patience, but keep at it. You got to work on it. And the last thing I'll say, that's really because of this new, I say that in quotations, that of like this digital world of like TikTok and social, like IG and like YouTube and stuff like that. There is a difference between the digital world and success in the digital world and success outside of the digital world. So don't convolute those two. And we can have a whole separate conversation. So like, maybe I'm sorry that I sort of am leaving with that, but like they're very different things. And I think people need to recognize that they're different things. But yeah, stay hungry, stay curious, work on your craft. Don't be an ass. Like, invest in yourself. Invest in yourself. Yeah. Like, and if I'm available. I coach artists and creatives, whether it's a side hustle or something that they're like want to move to full time or not, or they're doing it full time. But ask, right?
Awesome, Hina. Thank you so much again for your time. That was so valuable, and I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this can really take insight into what you just said, guys. If you liked the episode, make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe button to stay updated. Hina's material will all be in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. She's awesome, as you probably could tell. Take it easy, guys. I'll see you on the next episode of Brownie Points, and peace.